I'll be talking today about a range of topics that are, directly relevant to the changing character of philosophy of science in our time, I think. This won't be a sort of a standard philosophy talk where there's a sort of a clear argument and I'm arguing for a particular topic. But hopefully it'll stimulate some questions. When we think about the role of computing technology in science, I think that the tone was set by Paul Humphreys, who talked about extensions of ourselves. So his important 2008 book was called Extending Ourselves. And what we see is, what I'd like to talk about today is the idea of extending inquiry for finite agents. So we human beings, we're finite agents. Let's say our descendants, our maybe post-human descendants, will also be finite agents. So this applies not just to current humans, but also to future post-human descendants of ours. Past a certain point, our needs, our capacities are going to need to be extended. And I'm curious about the role of machine learning in the extension of inquiry. I think we think in philosophy of science about notions like progress in very specific ways, and I want to interrogate some of those. And I think we're in need of new metaphors and new ways of thinking about these questions. And I point you to the work of an artist named Dani Claude. So Dani, she's pictured here in this slide with one of her inventions, which is what she calls the third thumb. The third thumb is a prosthetic controlled by her feet, which allows her to do things like, for example, relatively useless but interesting things like stir a cup of tea with one hand. Okay, so this is a way of thinking about progress and prosthetics, the prosthetic or extending function of technologies that I think is fruitful. So we're looking at the creation of systems for inquiry then that are going to be, in some sense, prosthetic. And we want an expanded notion of progress where we think about many things. Obviously, optimization is a big part of this, expansion of possibilities, amplification, and so on. So how we go beyond our native constraints, our native cognitive constraints, is a core question. So it's trivial to say, but basically nowadays we use computers to extend inquiry for finite agents. And just to begin and be sort of like a philosopher here, I've given you definitions of what software is, what a software-intensive system is, and what a, these are definitions accepted by engineers. Clearly, it's the case that contemporary science is fundamentally dependent now on software-intensive systems. So way back, it feels like a long time ago, nearly a decade ago, Jack Horner and I began arguing that in order to understand what we called software-intensive science, and in the previous slide I gave you a definition of what software-intensiveness means, we're going to have to understand the limitations of software, and specifically the formal limits to things like testing and verification. So that work feels like a very long time ago, but it's still true. The general message is still true. I will say that a decade later, things have gotten much more interesting with the increasingly important role of machine learning in science. So what I'm going to say today, basic points, is that AI can play a role in scientific inquiry as something like a cognitive prosthetic. This was a phrase introduced by Clark Littmore back in '93. We reflect on it in 2018. You could also think of it, Ramon Alvarado has a recent paper thinking of AI as an epistemic technology. So I recommend that paper to you also as a sort of consideration of these questions. But I am interested in this idea of the prosthetic, and hopefully we can open some questions about that going forward. There's been a lot of talk about a kind of a post-human science or a sort of a post-singularity science. And I think that the signs of this post-human science have been deceptive. And in many ways, I think that when we carefully walk through the way machine learning operates in contemporary science, we see that it's always going to be shaped by the concerns of finite epistemic agents like us like us maybe in their finitude, not necessarily in their humanity, but in their finitude. And I think that thinking about the role of machine learning in inquiry lets us see more clearly the distinctively human aspects of contemporary science. So I don't think we're on the verge of a post-human science in that sense, in the sense of not being related to the interests of finite agents. Along the way, we'll talk about some of machine learning's virtues and vices, and we'll discuss a success story, which of course is AlphaFold, which is going to be familiar to many of you. We'll talk about some formal considerations, the no-go theorems that sort of block maximally general ambitions. We'll talk then about practical considerations. So one of the lessons of No Free Lunch, as we'll see, is the need for what's called domain-specific machine learning, and we'll look again at protein folding. I think philosophically there are a range of really deep questions related to this idea of domain. So domain is basically indispensable, this concept of domain in domain-specific machine learning. And so the question is, how should we think about the definition of domain? I don't think we can give it a formal characterization, but we can say a few things about it. That domain, for instance, is something like a region of concern. And human beings have concerns that are partly shaped by our resource constraints, our idiosyncratic, human goals and so on. But ultimately, not everything is relevant, and some things matter for our purposes and some things don't. And that fact makes a huge difference in the nature of inquiry. We'll talk a little bit too about progress in a domain, but I want to move on. So we've seen over the past 10 years enormous impact from machine learning already. So machine learning has affected biomedicine, physics, obviously a whole range, chemistry, a bunch of stuff. But it's not all good. But let's talk first about what is good. So what has been good, I just give you a sort of a sample of some highlights. You can look at these on the slides if you'd like later. But we could add hundreds and hundreds of papers to this that are genuinely important and high quality research. The impact of this work is increasing. The quality of the work is increasing. And so, for example, just last year, I recently read, at least new to me, was a reinforcement learning approach for discovering efficient and provably correct algorithms for the multiplication of arbitrary matrices. So you remember matrix multiplication from high school or from early college math. Alpha Tensor has discovered, I won't go into the details here, but algorithms that outperform for many matrix sizes what were heretofore the best performing matrix multiplication algorithms available. And this is the kind of thing that's just extraordinary. These are the kinds of extraordinary advances that machine learning is permitting. But there's also really ugly stuff coming and bad stuff. So the bad stuff, I'll point you to the work of Sayash Kapoor and Arvind Narayanan, who have recently, a very, very important paper. I think all philosophers should attend to this paper, Leakage and the Reproducibility Crisis in Machine Learning-Based Science. Kapoor and his advisor, Narayanan, were prompted to write this critical paper. It's a paper attacking sort of the methodological flaws. It does a wide survey of machine learning-driven science and finds basically near ubiquitous levels of methodological sort of mishandling of data, misuse of off-the-shelf methods, p-hacking, lack of reproducibility, and so on. They were prompted to do this research because Kapoor discovered a paper that claimed to predict civil wars with 95% success rates. Mm-hmm. So the claim was that using machine learning techniques, you could predict when a country was entering a civil war. Now, these papers are widely cited, in this case in political science, but ultimately they are deceptive and poorly argued and poorly researched. So we've seen an explosion in the number of papers since, let's say, 2018, close to doubling. We're up to 300,000 papers in 2021 on AI in artificial intelligence. I'll point you to Kapoor and Narayanan's Substack. It's called AISnakeoil.com, and they regularly post egregious examples of methodological error in this research. And there's a book coming out, so there should be a book probably by the fall. So that's the bad, and we do need to keep an eye on that. And I think that's an area where philosophers can make a decisively important contribution. And then there's the ugly. So the ugly is very ugly. So we saw in November of last year the release of Galactica. So Facebook produced this large language model assistant called Galactica, which was trained on 48 million examples of published research, and was designed to be a kind of a scientific research assistant. It was released, and maybe many of you saw this, within hours. We saw reactions on Twitter as to what Galactica was doing. So effectively, Galactica was able to master the rhetoric of scientific respectability. It was producing documents that looked like, that met expectations for the rhetoric of scientific respectability. But it was generating nonsense. It was generating hallucination. So immediately, the folks at Facebook pulled it down. After about 3 days. They saw that this was causing enormous reputational damage. Do you guys remember this incident, by the way? Yeah. So they saw that it was creating enormous reputational damage, and they pulled it down within 3 days. So they were aware that what they produced was untrustworthy. And so on the website for this, maybe the text is too small, you see that they talk about how these systems hallucinate. Okay? So be careful, this is hallucinating, this isn't reliable, it isn't trustworthy, don't make any big decisions based on this. So they knew what they were doing, but they thought they were providing a service of some sort. So we have this concept of hallucination in machine learning. And in many ways, a lot of what machine learning systems are doing, of course, is discovering statistically interesting patterns and then generating hypotheses, right? So it's a sort of a hypothesis generation system based on the discovery of these previously unseen statistical patterns. Now, the use of this term hallucination in the case of large language models has been criticized as sort of inappropriately anthropomorphic, and that's certainly true. It is kind of an anthropomorphic concept, the concept of hallucination, but it's still useful, I think. So when we hallucinate, we come to realize that we're hallucinating in virtue of, let's say, the friction of the world, let's say conversations with others, or checking. So if I feel like I've got bugs crawling on my arm, I can look to see whether there really are bugs crawling on my arm. I can ask you, did you hear that? Did you hear that noise? Or did you see that? And we can check. So in many ways, I think this is a useful concept, even though, of course, LLMs are not, strictly speaking, hallucinating. What's critical here is that, in order to realize that you are hallucinating, we human beings, we enter into a kind of conversation with the world. And it's also the case that an LLM, in order to sort of be sensitive to the character of its own hypothesis generation, needs to do something like that. So even if the training data for your large language model is all the text that Common Crawl pulls off the internet, it's still something like a closed system. It's not a conversation. Now, of course, there are methods that you can correct this with, and maybe during Q&A we can talk about that. So I'd like to step back a little bit and think more about this idea of the algorithm as the inquirer, the algorithm that could be something like a superintelligence down the road. And, it's tempting to think that because, these machine learning systems are ultimately something like very fancy conditional probability engines. And given the applicability of conditional probability to all ranges of inquiry, you could imagine one algorithm that could maybe handle all of these questions. But it's not true. It turns out that's simply not the case, and we have both formal and practical reasons for believing that won't be the case. So we'll talk a little bit about the no free lunch theorem now, and I'm sensitive to the time too. Okay. So we'll talk about the no free lunch theorem, and which shows, in effect, that given the way that the theorem is set up, there is no best model achieving best generalization error for every problem. So if a model A generalizes better to new data than model B, on one data set, there's another data set where model B works better. So we'll talk very briefly about that proof. I want to note here that the proof involves an assumption. And the assumption is that, and this is, let's say, Hume's assumption in the problem of induction, that every learning problem is equally likely. So it assumes that the world we'll encounter in the future has no knowables, need not have a knowable structure of its own, and that every encounter with the future will be, in principle, brand new, which is a reasonable assumption, but turns out you lose the capacity for one algorithm to rule them all if you accept that assumption. So the no free lunch theorem from Wolpert states that there's no best general purpose learning algorithm because when averaged over all possible learning tasks, and that's a big set, the performance difference between any two is negligible. Now, the right way to read the no free lunch theorem, in my opinion, and this is maybe part of the reason that machine learning folks get so irritated by no free lunch, is that really what it's saying is that for any particular learning task, you have to tailor the algorithm at hand to the specific task in order to get good performance. So a context-specific algorithm is what you're going to end up with, ultimately. Otherwise, you get subpar optimization. And that, in some ways, is actually kind of trivial. But it's part of the reason that there's controversy around the no free lunch theorems. But at first blush, no free lunch seems to suggest that rolling a dice is just as good as anything else in inquiry. And that's what upsets machine learning folks. And it's actually not true, because the no free lunch theorem, of course, applies only if the target function is chosen from a uniform distribution of all possible functions. So the future world, of course, as we encounter it in our lives, the relevant future world, is not uniformly distributed. The second major point, I mean, basically, the no free lunch theorem supports a kind of common sense assumption that we need something like domain-specific inputs to machine learning challenges. So we're going to look now at domain-specific machine learning in the case of protein folding. So the protein folding problem is an incredibly difficult, or has been until relatively recently, an incredibly daunting challenge. So why is this? Well, these are slides from DeepMind. You probably are familiar with the basics of protein folding. But ultimately, we're talking about 3D structure. And we're talking about 3D structure actually on multiple levels. So proteins have relevant kinds of structural features on multiple levels. And it's the structure that does the work in many of the key biological processes that we're interested in. So the structure is critical. And this structure is like many interacting levels of structure, which is even more complicated. So, when we think about the most fundamental level of structure in this case, which would be, or for this topic, the amide chain here, the amino acid chains, and we think about then, for example, biologically functional structures where, let's say, we have interacting 3D protein structures, you've got a combination of highly unstable, let's say from the starting point here, the amino acid chain can form potentially countless, innumerable possible stable 3D structures. And you've got a variety, I mean, you've got lots and lots of interacting physical and chemical constraints in operation that just exponentially expand. I mean, you have aspects of the protein folding challenge that are provably NP hard. I mean, it's a deeply challenging problem. At the same time, we've known since the 1950s that a lot of the sort of the most significant biologically relevant, let's say, proteins fold in ways that are pretty predictable, pretty stable, and strongly correlate with their amide sequences. So, to put that another way, the sequence of amino acids in principle could form in lots and lots of different ways. It could form a 3D structure in lots of different ways. It turns out that the most biologically important ones, we've known since the 50s, do regular kinds of things and fold in very regular kinds of ways, probably as a result of natural selection. So we know all of that we know about protein structure via experimental work with X-ray crystallography and other techniques. But that had proven very expensive. So I think by 2017, on average, figuring out the 3D structure of a protein cost $100,000 US. But then we saw the breakthrough, the extraordinary breakthrough over the past 2 years, where AlphaFold seems to have, or claims to have, solved the protein folding problem. So I'll just remind you that in recent decades, you could write a whole PhD dissertation on determining the structure of a single protein. Today, we press a button, and literally in minutes, you can find 3D structure. Okay, so this was huge news, and this is an extraordinary success story. I want to talk a little bit about how we measure success and how we think about success and progress in inquiry. So this is the slide I'm showing you now is results of what's called CASP. And CASP was a challenge. It's the critical assessment of structure prediction. It was a test that was held every year. I guess it's pointless now, but it has been held since the mid-90s to assess the power of various prediction techniques given novel proteins. So they know, the testers know what the correct 3D structure is for the amide sequence that's given to these teams. The teams are given the amino acid sequence and then asked to predict the 3D structure, and then there's a score assigned. The score here, this is the beginning of machine learning right here around 2016. Today, you see that effectively AlphaFold has solved, at least with respect to CASP, AlphaFold has solved the protein folding problem, given this characterization of success. The characterization of success that's given is called the global distance test. So here we've got the ground truth case, and that's experimentally confirmed, then the computer-generated case, the predicted case of 3D structure for the amino acids, and then a measure of match. So this would be an example of a success story. Now notice that 94% match is it's a sufficiently big gap, that's 6%, to include, let's say, mutations in proteins, but we can talk about that later, okay? So we've got this clear measure of progress in inquiry, and we can see actually quite clearly how this happens, or how machine learning has effectively met that challenge and hit those marks. I'll just remind you, though, that this goes back to 1971, so, and earlier, I guess to the 50s really, but in 1971, we see in the protein data bank, the original protein data bank, we had 7 known structures. By 99, we had 10,000 structures, all experimentally confirmed. By 2008, 50,000 structures. And by 2014, prior to the rise of machine learning, we had 100,000 structures. So notice that there's an extraordinarily rich history here supporting the training of AlphaFold. The training data here is extraordinarily rich. Notice also that the optimization target for CASP's competition is very clearly defined, right? So the global distance test is a very clear target for the system in question. I'll also mention it is true that aspects of the problem are known to be NP hard, and we see this is where really we can sort of leverage machine learning for overcoming computationally intractable challenges. But I also want to say that this is kind of like a game. This forms a game-like structure. The constraints for the protein folding problem are pretty well defined. The training data, the sort of the background story of the game, is well articulated and richly grounded in experimental research. The optimization target is very clearly defined. And I think all of those things together create a kind of a beautiful domain, a beautiful target for machine learning efforts. But note it, and this has proved extraordinarily successful. So this is how these domains are kind of shaped to set up machine learning efforts for success. I won't walk you through the entire history of the AlphaFold project. I do want to hit on a couple of, I think, philosophically relevant features, which is the idea of hallucination, attempts to produce brute force solutions, and then gradual corrections using domain-specific knowledge on the space of hallucinated 3D structures to good effect. So you'll all remember maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, Rosetta Fold at Home, where people were, I guess it's the 2000s, where people were assigning their own hard drives in their own computer space for this project. And the attempt then was to infer sequence 3D structure from sequences of amides, but few usable results. I won't say too much. Obviously, simulating folding becomes, the computational cost of simulating folding is intractably large. What Baker and his colleagues at University of Washington did, though, was they basically trained up a deep learning system and fed the system random amide sequences to see what they could find. It turns out that this was a kind of without sort of over, the results were promising. So they created more than 100 small proteins, and about 20% of those were usable and hit the desired shape. So remember, one of the functions of this research is to create 3D structures that we want. We want 3D structures for particular purposes. And in this case, Baker and his team, using the hallucination method we talked about earlier, were able, in 1/5 of the cases, to make small proteins that did the job. I won't go through the sort of the back and forth of how the team developed. I'll just end this piece by noting that the real breakthrough, was approaching the problem in two directions. So one of the team members, Justice Doparat, was working on an inverse of the standard problem. So what Doparat was doing was was guessing the underlying amide structure of given 3D protein structure. So rather than predicting 3D structure from the amino acid sequence, he was working backwards from 3D structure to guesses about the amide sequence. He developed a tool that, in combination with the standard approaches of the team, were able to give extraordinarily good results. So by July of last year, 27 of 30 designs that passed Doparat's method were confirmed by experimental technique. So this is why why it's such an exciting development. Notice again, we've got this kind of game-like structure where we've got the goals, we've got the beginnings, and we're sort of meeting in the middle in this solution. So there's lots of things that have come out of this, and lots more is coming. I'll save you these details and refer you to the slides. All kinds of exciting applications. This is extraordinary research and one of the great successes of machine learning in our time. So what should we take away then as philosophers from the protein folding application of machine learning? What I'm going to say is that in order to be useful, machine learning has to incorporate an extraordinary range of topic-specific or domain-specific constraints. It relies heavily on domain-specific knowledge, things that real human beings know about real parts of the real world. And I think critical here also is disciplined training sets. So what was extraordinary, or what was crucial, I think, for the AlphaFold was the 100,000 existing known structures that were available on PDB, on the protein database. I think what we can say is that here we have a hypothesis-generating system, a kind of hallucinatory system that can be constrained and shaped and guided in ways that help us, obviously, progress in inquiry, but also help these systems move towards what matters. So there's lots to be said about this concept of progress and in inquiry, and I think I want to say a few things here about the idea of iteration. So what we mean by progress and inquiry, I think, is closely related to the idea of an iterative process. And when we think about progress and inquiry, of course, there's all kinds of debates, is progress a meaningful term, et cetera, but there are also sort of formally tractable and abstract characterizations of progress and inquiry that are worth our attention. I think, probably the most highly developed would be the kind of thing that you find, for example, in algorithmic learning theory, and that comes ultimately from Charles Sanders Peirce. So Peirce held, as you all know, that inquiry through an iterative process converges on the truth. So the objective of inquiry for Peirce is truth. Truth, we get it in the limit of inquiry, according to Peirce. And you can see Peirce, and you can see later developments of his ideas in algorithmic learning theory as a kind of optimization task on the objective of inquiry. So very similar to the kind of thing we find in machine learning-driven science. I just note some, in addition to Peirce, Vincent Hendricks, for example, argued that this was characteristic of scientific knowledge, that this idea of convergence in the limit of empirical inquiry was a kind of a core characteristic of scientific knowledge. And for Peirce, it was actually unphilosophical to argue that this wasn't the case, that convergent inquiry wouldn't lead to the truth. He thought that that was basically an unphilosophical position to hold. So this kind of algorithmic-based inquiry has a long history. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead, but we know, for example, that optimizing on an objective, understanding it, well, okay, let's see. So I mentioned algorithmic learning theory. Again, in algorithmic learning theory, this predates, of course, machine learning in the modern sense. We have very clear and formally tractable characterization of what it means for things to succeed and fail, what it means for progress to happen, et cetera. And they're all sort of convergentist models. Again, owing a great deal to Peirce's model of inquiry. Now, when Peirce, and philosophers will recall, when Peirce originally articulates this model of, or this account, his definition of truth, philosophers like Bertrand Russell immediately rejected it. They say, look, it's not a good definition of truth to say truth is what inquiry converges to in the limit, because I know that 2 + 2 is 4 is true independently. I'm not yet in the limit of inquiry, and I know that already. Other philosophers of science have noted, for example, what they call the buried treasure problem for Peirce's account, that you have this convergent process of inquiry, but there are many spots in the neighborhood where you could be finding interesting things and you're not because maybe of the character of the process. Anyway, Peirce's model of inquiry is interesting because you can see it sort of embodied in algorithmic learning theory. You can see it in a kind of in the seeds of machine learning's characterization of domain-specific machine learning, but it's not science per se, right? So in practice, human inquiry is not a sort of a wide open field. It usually begins from somewhere. And we have concerns that define the domain of interest. It's also the case that inquiry tends to generate new questions and open new possibilities rather than providing improved answers iteratively to the same question, right? So it's not like we're asking the same question over and over again and getting iteratively better processes. But notice that that's precisely how we make progress in machine learning-driven science. So in machine learning-driven science, if the domain can be constrained in suitable ways, if the target can be well-defined, then we've got a domain that can be a fertile space for machine learning. It can become what we could call a region of inquiry, suitable for methods that converge towards well-defined goals. So those well-defined goals provide the basis for the optimization task. And I think that's the real lesson here, is that, okay, we've got a very particular kind of prosthetic, right? Machine learning provides us a very particular kind of prosthetic. The prosthetic only works within very well-characterized domains. The target of optimization has to be as clear as possible, as well-defined as possible. Given these constraints, this is an awesome tool. Okay, just to close, how many? Okay, I'm basically done. So we've got a lot of open questions that arise out of these kinds of considerations. So how do we understand the definition of a domain? And what does the definition of the domain tell us about the nature of inquiry? Some of the noises I've been making today indicate something like, well, domain is a region of concern. It's the kind of thing that human beings care about. Human beings have concerns that are shaped partially by our constraints, by our resource constraints, by our history, by our natality. We also have concerns that are shaped by our mortality. The fact that we're going to run out of time means that certain kinds of progress, certain kinds of projects, and certain kinds of methods are not of interest to us. And ultimately, as we know from the philosophy of science, goals, purposes, etc., of inquiry are shaped by our value, by our values, by our cultural and historical context. So we know, for example, if we think about the explanation literature, that there are going to be a variety of true accounts of any phenomenon. Take Putnam's case of the forest fire, when Hilary Putnam looks at the forest fire and he says, look, the forest fire admits of a wide range of true accounts. So the aliens flying above in their spaceship could look down at the forest fire and say, well, you know, this atmosphere is dangerously saturated with oxygen. We got to watch out. That is true. The sheriff looks for the fire, the campfire, let's say, or evidence of arson. The biologist looks to the health of the forest. The climate scientist thinks about the changing climactic story. All of these are distinct kinds of explanations, all of which are true, some of which are on target, given the domains of interest, some aren't. So not everything is going to be relevant for us. And when we just recognize that fact, that not everything is relevant for us, then we can go back to something like the no free lunch theorem and say, well, that means that not every learning problem is equally likely, right? So I'm not arguing at all against the no free lunch theorem, but I am saying that, these considerations all together, taken together, both the formal considerations and the history of successful science, indicate the centrality of this idea of domain, and that domain-specific machine learning will be, I think, and is a topic that we philosophers of science need to give real attention to, but that also it illuminates traditional questions in philosophy of science in beautiful new ways. And I hope that opens the basis for a conversation going forward. So thank you for your attention. I know that was a lot of material.